in the midst of, going out and trying to find a deal and trying to find partners to put out my next project, I realized that I didn't want to be overly sexualized. I thought that would be deterring and weaken my brand. Mm-hmm. And the shift is still sort of taking place, but I see my peers who are talking much louder and, are far more narcissistic than I could ever be. And I'm like, I don't want that smoke. I don't even want to compete with those girls.
Let's get it started.
Double O.
Free range, motherfucker. Yeah. Welcome to the Free Range Podcast. This is your host, Double O. I've been in the music industry about 10 plus years, and I can probably count on one hand, maybe even only 2 or 3 fingers, in all the collaborations and all of the different artists, producers, graphic designers, video directors, whomever, how many women I've been able to actually work with that weren't artists. There's always been this void, this question of where is the female producer in the music industry. It sometimes seems confusing to me because when you look at many child prodigies playing piano, playing an instrument, there are women in the space. And there are a ton of female artists operating at the top level of every chart and every other capacity. But there's this wide gap in between. Today on the podcast, I have one of my close homies and one of probably the only female producers that I've been able to work with, Smiles Davis. She's an LA-based DJ and producer. She is a promoter. You've probably heard her songs on Insecure. And I wanted to really explore this conversation and talk about potentially the roadblocks in her going from being an Alvin Ailey dancer to being a DJ and then a producer. How comfortable she is in the position of power in the room, in the studio, when you're trying to get a song done. How important other women are in the industry in terms of building a support system. We also dig into stuff that I actually don't think many people get to talk about, which is the balance that an artist has to play these days between feeding the content beast of social media, how they're portrayed in that space, the cheat code that women have in that they can be a little bit sexier and gain a lot of followers a lot faster, but how that may affect their art and how that may affect their well-being. I think it's really awesome and important podcast. I'm glad that she made the time to come on. Let's check it out. Smiles Davis. You can follow her at DJ Smiles Davis on everything. Follow me at GoDouble0, GODOUBLE0. Let's go. What up, what up, what up? It's Double O, back with another edition of the Free Range Podcast. And I'm here with the homie.
Hey,
DJ Smiles Davis or just Smiles Davis? Have you gone to the point like I have where you cut the DJ off? Or?
I'm cutting the DJ off. Yeah.
Okay.
Smiles Davis, please. Pretty please.
Any reason in particular for
I think the DJ's limiting. I mean, I do a lot more than just DJ. And I've always kind of known this, but I think I've avoided kind of handling that side of my business. Trademarking, making sure all my socials are... There's some continuity between everything, and at the moment there isn't. So now that I have a whole squad, they're like, get your shit together.
All right, awesome. Well, we'll get there. We got to start at the beginning, though. In doing research on you, which is always funny when I end up doing this stuff with people that I know, I'm like, there's all this stuff that I get to uncover that is brand new to me. So I did not know that you start your kind of entertainment existence as a dancer.
Yeah.
Before any of the DJing stuff. And that was like serious.
Yes.
So where does that start for you in your youth? Like when you were a kid, you were just always dancing?
No, actually, I didn't start dancing until I was in high school.
Really?
I had never taken a dance class at all until freshman year, and maybe ninth grade. And I went to a middle school, and then I went to a proper high school. And by the time I got to freshman year, I had a profound, I guess you would call teacher, you can't call him professor, but, you know, I should say she was a remarkable teacher who had a profound effect on me. And she just really knew how to inspire the youth and to make them think that achieving higher goals was easier than had been presented to them prior. And so that first year, you know, ballet was the center focus, but occasionally she would mix in some hip hop or modern dance. And then
was this a required class, or this was something you just decided to take?
It was an elective. I just decided to take it. I had been very athletic.
Okay.
I've been running track and playing basketball up until that point for a couple of years. And second semester freshman year, she took us to go see Alvin Ailey. It's like the most renowned Black dance company in the world. And just their like muscle definition and their attention to detail and like it just looked like they were like praising a higher being, you know, with their arms always stretched and their pelvises always like giving to the earth. I was just like, this is the baddest shit I've ever seen. It's like, oh, this takes me to Africa immediately. And I told her, I remember leaving that concert and I told her, I want to dance for Alvin Ailey now. Yeah. I didn't even know they existed before she took me to this show, you know? And I shouldn't say me, it was the whole class. Yeah. But she was like, that's a good goal. Let's, you know, work on that, you know? And she made sure every semester to check in with me, like, was I reaching my goals? And like, where was my extensions getting better? Was I gaining more flexibility? Was I building more strength? And freshman year of college, I auditioned and I got in. It was 4 years later.
So did you have her as a teacher after that freshman year?
Freshman year of high school through senior year of high school, I had her as a teacher.
Oh, yes. That's awesome.
Yes. And she, senior year of high school, she did take me to New York to go to a proper Alvin Ailey seminar. We stopped in Chicago and did some dancing with Bob Fosse, and then we went on to Alvin Ailey.
just with the G's, just all of it, huh?
Yeah, I was like, at the time, I think I was 15. Yeah. And, freshman year of college, I was like, fuck it. I don't think I'm ready for this, but I'm just going to go to Vegas. I'm going to drive down there with a couple other dancer friends, and I'm going to see what's up, you know? And I went with who I thought were better dancers than me. Mm-hmm. But I was the only one that got in. I did not have the skill that they had. And I don't think that it was a skill purely based on skill. I think it was based on poise. I think it was based on muscular structure. I think it was based on your ability to let go of traditional teachings and sort of allow, you know, these like grounded center of gravity movements take over everything that you had learned in ballet.
Do you think some of that comes from having been an athlete so long, where you essentially, you learn, you drill, you learn everything that you have to, and then in the moment, all of that has to get thrown out because it has to be essentially automatic and, you know.
Yes, precisely. I mean, every sport that I played up until that point was a group effort.
Yeah. So except track.
Did I run? Yes, I did run the open 4 by myself. I was thinking of all the relays, baton relays and things like that, but I do think the sports background definitely played a part in that.
Awesome. So then do you have to leave college to go to Alvin Ailey?
I did. I left college for a year. Okay. And I got my independent study at Alvin Ailey in New York. thereafter, I was, thinking I would go to Atlanta and transfer to Spelman and do the, HCBU.
BCU.
Did I say that backwards?
Yeah, it's fine.
What am I thinking?
HBCU.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Historic Black College.
Yes.
I thought that's what I wanted to do. Okay. And I got there and it was so black that it frightened me. Like, I love my heritage. I love where I come from. And today, if that same opportunity were presented to me, I would snatch it in a heartbeat. But at that time...
Yeah, what was the culture shock from?
The culture shock was heavy because I was coming from Arizona. I'm originally from Grand Rapids, Michigan, where it's, there's a lot of blacks, there's a lot of whites. But after my parents got divorced, I moved to Arizona, and it's predominantly white there. Yeah. I'd never seen all black people anywhere other than like my grandma's house, And so I got to Spelman, and it was like 3 weeks before class was starting. I had been accepted in, I had registered for classes, and I was auditioning for Atlanta City Ballet, and I didn't get in. And I think that was a deterrent on my spirit. I was like, that's a sign. Like, what's my focus here if I don't have that? Yeah. And I was like, I can't be one of these girls that gets into sororities. Like, I don't want to be in a sorority. Like, dance is my sorority. Yeah. I don't have time for anything else. And so I left. I went back to Arizona and quickly realized that my mental had shifted so far into professionalism world and out of the academic world that I needed to go immerse myself in that. So I moved to LA.
So you immediately moved to LA?
Yeah.
Okay. What made you not stay in New York, knowing how vast the dance world is there?
Well, New York is very expensive.
Yes.
And I was struggling to make a life for myself there. And I was really young. I was 19.
Yeah.
And so it was like, I couldn't really work at a bar. I couldn't do like bartending gigs and make tips. And I couldn't serve alcohol as a waitress. So it was like kind of challenging to figure out where I fit in. And at the time I was living with my uncle in Long Island, and the commute was about an hour and a half, I want to say. So I would wake up before the sun came up to get to the city, to be in a dance room for 8 hours and not even really even have time for work. Yeah. And I was like, there's no way I can make this life work, And so I thought LA was more of an appeal because it was closer to my mom and the sun's always shining and everybody's so pretty.
But did you come here focused on dance, though?
I came focused on dance. And then I quickly realized, about 3 years in, I realized...
That's not quickly.
I mean, for a dancer, the worlds are drastically different. Okay. And I just kept thinking, there's something else around the corner.
Yeah.
Maybe if I just get to this next level, I'll get to those kind of auditions that I was going to in New York.
What were you trying to do when you first got here?
Just make money.
Okay.
Doing cool shit.
Yeah.
Working for dope people. I auditioned for Beyonce. I auditioned for Lenny Kravitz. I auditioned for Janet Jackson. I mean, like, that was very standard. But then I was like, oh, this is the difference between New York and LA dance culture. You are beholden to music videos, and award shows and touring. That is the dance culture here. Yeah. There's not much outside of that. Whereas in New York, you have Broadway. So there's so many more opportunities for dancers in New York who are professionally trained, or I should say traditionally trained. And less here in LA. It's more of like, how many different genres of dance do you know? How many can you force into one audition, and like, it just didn't work for me. I wasn't trained that way. I did know multiple styles of dance, but I didn't want to be gyrating in a Ludacris video.
Yeah, coming from ballet.
Coming from that background. Yeah. So I retired. I had some injuries that I was like trying to rehabilitate, and I was just like exhausted. And I had just started DJing. I just learned how to do my first mix, and I was like already making a couple $100 here and there.
Did you know that did you see that on the horizon, or was DJing something that you just kind of picked up along the way as you were dancing? Like, oh, I'm interested in music. I'm interested in this. Like, what even made you pick that up as an idea?
My grandparents owned a record store in the 70s. Mm-hmm. And they also worked on Beale Street, which is where Stax Records comes from. So I grew up in a family setting that was just like ripe with music culture. So I already knew a lot of that prior to even being a dancer. And then you add on top of that, you know, classic Americana, especially black music. And then you add on top of that this like tribal sort of style that I had learned at Alvin Ailey. And I was like, you know, I think I have a lot of music knowledge. And my first real job in LA was at Amoeba Records.
Okay.
And I just got that job to make ends meet, and it sounded cool. And then I was like, oh, I can like blend these two records and like have someone cut a check, you know? It was always something I would desire to learn to do.
Okay, so it was always kind of just sitting back there like, oh, one day I'll learn that.
Yes, when I was at Arizona State, there was this guy that lived across the hall from me in the Commons who had turntables in his dorm, and I would always go over there and attempt to pretend like I knew what I was doing, but I was trash. I mean, like I literally didn't blend anything for the first year I attempted it. And then I bought some CDJs, and it really simplified it. You know, you can stick the CD in, press a couple buttons, and you're like, oh, I get it. Now if I could just use my hands to actually do this, then we're on and cracking. Yeah. And that was like the infancy stages of it, you know? And then by the time, next thing you know, I'm quitting my job at Amoeba to pursue it full time.
So what was your first DJ gig?
A friend of mine, I had been a closet DJ up until that point for probably a year and a half, 2 years. And a friend of mine was like, hey, I'm having a birthday party at my brother's barbershop. It's like up the street from you. Can you bring your gear and play some records? And I was like, yeah, that sounds like fun. And that tricked off into 2 other gigs, and then, you know, another gig, and, you know, it just word of mouth spreads quickly. It's like, you have a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of skill, and you're cheap. Because at the time, I think I was only charging like $200-$300 for gigs.
Yeah, that's about the LA standard, unfortunately, in a lot of places. And you're around, this is around the time where the kind of like, you get this ramp up to the like, obviously EDM house music, but like the DJ explosion in LA, right? Where it's like up until, there was a point where it was kind of just like, well, DJs exist, but it was hip hop guys mostly known in that space. And now you're about to have, this is like right around that time that there's the explosion, right? Or you have AM and Cinespace popping.
Yes, that was definitely around that time, because I had 0 female mentors. There wasn't, I don't even at the time think that I knew of anyone other than DJ Rashida. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know her personally. I had been dating her lawyer. And he was like, oh, one of my clients is a female DJ. You should meet her. She's Prince's DJ. And I was like, my head spun, you know? Yeah. And that was sort of the creme de la creme of female DJs. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't get any bigger than being Prince's
it
DJ.
Does not. But yeah, you're right. There is really like this space where nothing kind of exists.
No.
In terms of LA.
Yeah. Yeah. And then probably 2 or 3 years later, I started seeing, you know, people popping up everywhere. I had put out a mixtape, which was called Preach. It was like an illustration of my face on the cover, and I put it up online. I must have put it up on like Fileshare or something. And I started posting it on MySpace in like the comment section of like Diplo's page and whoever else I could get my hands on. And I think I maybe spent like a day or two just like copying and pasting. And on the third day, I woke up and there were over 10,000 streams. And I was like, whoa, that worked. And I would like be walking around and people were like, yo, that mixtape is fire. And I didn't realize at the time that the mixtape culture was a thing outside of the DJ culture. And it was just going to help elevate me, you know?
Were you taking it seriously at that point? Or was this just kind of like all of because there's all these stages in terms of DJing, where, especially where you're like, oh, I'm making money now, right? So you have that basic sort of the live side of it.
I wasn't really taking it that serious. It was still kind of just fun for me. I mean, I'm in my early 20s. Yeah. Making serious money is not a concern.
Yeah.
It's just like, let me just get by. Let me put food on my table. Let me like keep the roof over my head. If I need to buy things that I need, I have money for it. Yeah. You know, making $100,000 in a year was not even a glimmer of a thought. Yeah. And so in that sense, yes, I was making money, but I don't think I started making real money until about 5 years in.
But when was the shift for you? So you start, it's just fun. You make some money, cover the bills. When does the shift happen with that Preach mixtape where you're like, oh, because when I think about you as a DJ, it's never just like, oh, there's this person I go see DJ. It's always been Smiles Davis is kind of like the thing, brand. The artist, and the idea.
Yeah.
So when does that start to creep its way into, you know, what you have going on?
I got sent an email from this woman who I don't even think I was that close with. It was an article. It was an ad on Craigslist that was like, looking for DJ, you know, must have knowledge about music, but not want to educate the crowd, you know, please send resume, age, and like a DJ like reel if you have it or something like that. And I replied and didn't think anything of it, but I got a reply from that guy seconds later. And it was like, you sound great. Can you meet me for coffee? And I was like, Craigslist ad, this must be some creepy weirdo, you know? So I went online and I looked at this guy's name, and we only had one mutual friend on all of our social platforms. Mm-hmm. And that one mutual friend happened to be somebody whose opinion I highly trusted. Okay. So I called him and I was like, hey, I see online that you're friends with this guy. Can you tell me a little bit about him? He's asking me to go to coffee. I just want to make sure he's not a creep. And he immediately goes, take the meeting. And I was like, oh shit, okay. So I go, we have coffee in Silver Lake, and he's like, you're great. Yeah, you're great. Can you come by and film a little video in my house with your stuff, like a 5-minute video of you mixing, and then I'll just start getting you booked on stuff. And I was like, sure. So I went over there like literally the next day with a crate full of records. I think I had like the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, Maps remix in there. I think I had like some Diplo remix in there, and like what's that, Steve Miller Band, I Heat Up, that song. And I just mashed up for 5 minutes, and he was like, fuck, this is amazing, you know? And within a week, he was calling me like, hey, I got this gig for you here, or hey, I got this gig for you there. And it was mainly corporate gigs and weddings, but it was such good money. It was like, oh, I don't have to promote this to people that I'm doing it. I'm just going to go take the check in silence and then do my cool cultural shit because I can fund it now. Yeah. And that first year with him, I made a ton of money. Yeah. Like my accountant, he was like, I don't even understand how you just went from what you were making to what you're making now. He's like, this is what the DJ world is like? And I was like, I don't know. Like, I guess this is amazing. This sounds like an opportunity, but I don't think it's available to everyone.
Yeah. You mentioned something interesting there. Accountant.
Yeah.
When does that come into your life in general? Did you have an accountant just early on?
I had an accountant early on because I'm terrible with finances. And so I needed somebody to kind of be my checks and balances. Like,
So you knew, regardless of what you made, that you needed to have somebody like that involved in your...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Better than me. Still.
I pay my taxes every year since I started making money. And he's kind of just been there along the way. But, yeah.
So I assume that guy is essentially your manager at this point.
Who?
The guy
that
who's
was
getting
booking
you
me?
gigs. Yeah.
No, I wouldn't say that. And in fact, he tried everything in his power to deter me from thinking that he was my manager.
Okay.
But he was a DJ himself. And what it was he was very good. I'm talking about, Z-Trip, Girl Talk good.
Yeah.
Where he's mashing up and he's blending every 30 seconds. And he was getting booked on so many gigs, he couldn't do them. Mm. So what you have is like this... The wedding industry was taking a turn at that time from being super cliche and, YMCA to people realizing that, no, I want my wedding to be like a night out with my friends. Yeah. I don't want to hear cheesy wedding music. I want you to play Kitchenada. I want you to play Anderson .Paak. I want you to play Soulja Boy. I want it to be a party. You can throw in some Temptations. You can throw in some Motown. Amazing. You'll make my parents happy. Yeah. But do it in a cool, creative way. And at that time, the wedding industry was going through a shift, not only musically, but all across the board. So you have photographers and videographers and chefs and organizers all really taking this leap into like how much more creativity can I shove into this, even though it's supposed to be cliche.
Yeah.
So I really came up with like these new age vendors who were on the precipice of, this creative engine. And I feel like the wedding industry helped shift all the other industries, and some people don't even realize that, but like my friend Jessie Chamberlain, who started as a wedding photographer, is now like she makes like 50 grand a shoot doing like commercials and cool branded stuff, but she started in the wedding industry.
Well, did you ever have, so many DJs always feel a way about certain kind of gigs? Was that ever something that you had to wrestle with, where you're like, am I going to become just a wedding DJ?
Oh, yes. So I bought a car. I filled my closet with nice things that, made me feel good. And then I realized that what was really important to me was being culturally relevant. And, some people can't escape their culture. Yeah. Like you are of the culture no matter how you try. And I think I'm one of those people, like I go to certain events, I hang out with certain people, like that is just my life. Yeah. I don't force it. But I do think the weddings would have been the death of me eventually, because by the 200th wedding, you're just like, I can't do it anymore. Yeah. I don't care if I'm playing even cool shit. Like, and to be honest with you, the thing that was really daunting on me was that out of the 200 weddings plus that I DJ'd, I only DJ'd for Black people like twice. Mm. So I was like, that was taking a toll on me within itself. You have this bi Black coming into play, and you have all of these people being very adamant about supporting things in Black culture. And it was having an effect on my mental. So I had to take a step back, and I eventually quit working for that guy. He was just taking way too much money. That was the main thing. He was taking 50%.
Jeez.
Like, I was making good money.
And he still was making as good money.
He was still making 3 or 4 times as much as I was. So, it was a learning lesson for me, a very valuable one, in that nothing prepared me for the kind of gigs that I get now more than weddings.
Yeah, I often, same thing for me is like, when I was DJing weddings, it was in high school, and it was the terrible old school weddings that you're thinking
Oh
about,
no, the
where
weddings
you're-
that I were doing were like over $100,000. You
Yeah,
know,
this was none
like
of that.
this was like these people were always very wealthy. I was always extremely well taken care of. You know, I'd be staying at the Four Seasons, and they'd be getting married at some like multi-million-dollar estate. Like, you know, it was like I DJ'd a wedding at Martha Stewart's house. You know, like these are posh
Yeah.
events that put me in Vogue and Harper's Bazaar. And I think that people at weddings want to go in. They want to go hard. You're the only source of entertainment. They didn't hire a band. They hired you, right? So I had to come with it for 4, sometimes 6 hours of just like smack, smack, smack,
Yeah, yeah.
smack, you know? And that prepares you for these little hour sets at festivals or like Good Looks or whatever, you know? And so I walked away with that positive little cookie from doing all these
Yeah,
weddings.
there is also, I think, it is the place, not the only place, but it's definitely a place where all the vendors, like everything is really about properly teasing and pleasing the crowd in
Yeah.
a certain way.
Yeah.
And so you really get a good class in not only just understanding like their wants and needs, but really just also how to provide this entire vibe around everything. Because nobody, the amount of weddings that I've done, when you get a list of songs that they want, like they're always just so ridiculous and weird and all over the board. Being able to turn that into a story that they can, you know, that you can tell over the night is something that is always, I think, is a lot harder than people think than just, you know, again, showing up to the club. You're like, okay, at a certain point, I'm just going to play all the hits, and it doesn't really, you know,
Right.
doesn't really matter. So you pull back from the wedding stuff, and you get back into what I assume is kind of like really shifting focus in terms of DJing and more clubs, more events, festivals.
Before I quit weddings, I had started a creative collective with a friend of mine down in Chicago. And we were basically renting a house purely for the sake of doing, you know, different creative things.
Yeah.
You know, building sets, throwing parties, you know, cooking for our friends, doing showcases. And we started this thing once a month where we would invite maybe like 40 or 50 of our friends, come sit on the floor and drink wine. And we would invite an emerging artist to come perform 2 or 3 songs. And that went on for as long as we could get away with it in this little house off of Gramercy and Melrose. And, you know, the neighbors eventually were tuned in to the fact that, you know,
You're having
what's
you
happening?
have a venue.
Do any of you guys even live here? Like, what's going on? You know. So we started taking it to venues, and you know, I did Moses Sumney's first show in LA. At least I thought it was his first show. Joey Dosick and Quinn, and you know, very long list. Katia Bonet was first show in LA, and so we were on the precipice of all these young, up and coming artists, and it was more just fun for us than it was a work thing. And I took the idea to that guy I was working with, the weddings, and I said, you know, you should get in on this. Maybe you can be like a silent investor and really help us get to another level. And he said no. And I was so offended that he didn't have faith in what I was doing that it drove a fork between our relationship.
Was it? Do you think it was that he didn't have faith in it, or that he was extremely comfortable?
It might have been that he had faith in it, but like was extremely comfortable. I just, from a standpoint, I couldn't understand how you champion someone like that and like don't support them, right? We had other internal issues. Obviously, he's taking 50% and becoming resentful about that. He's bringing on other DJs. Now there's 5 of us and there's not just 2. So they're eating off the resource pie. And I just felt like I was getting kind of squeezed out. So I left. we parted ways. And at the time, I was like, you know, I really want to focus on this event thing and really help all these emerging artists kind of build this platform for them, and I can use it as well. And it eventually dissolved just because we just couldn't really hone in on how to make money and not drive ourselves crazy, because we weren't charging. Everything that we did was donated. Even when we did venues, like the venues just trusted me because I had done so many weddings at these various different venues around town. And I had been grandfathered in. And so they'd be like, oh, yeah, normally it's like $4,000 to rent the space, but we'll give it to you, Smiles. We know who you are. Like, you're cool. You can come in with your 50 friends or whatever. It's all chill. Just hire a cleaner, you know? And it's hard to get people to transition from going to a free event to then charging them for that event. Or you have to bring in sponsors. And we just couldn't really figure it out. And before long, my focus shifted to, let me make sure that I'm making my music, and that is my priority.
When does that happen? When do you shift into not just wanting to be a DJ, not just playing records, but saying, oh, I want to make music now?
I think originally it started out as sort of an inclination to one up all of my peers. Because as you said, there was this boom where everywhere you looked, everybody's turning into a DJ. Oh, I was a graphic designer, but I'm DJing now. Or, oh, I was a stylist, I'm DJing now, you know? And I would see all these girls jumping on the scene, and I was like, oh, this is great. There's more room. I mean, there's more community now. But I was feeling like I was getting squeezed in terms of like my access to the bigger events, because now there's so much competition. So originally it started as, okay, I talked to several managers. I talked to, you know, Lori Boo, who manages Z-Trip, or I don't think she does anymore. She manages Shepherd Ferry. And she was like, yeah, I'm interested, but you got to make your own music. And I was like, oh, okay. Let me see if I can figure this out. And it took me a long time. It took me longer than I thought to get to a place where I was comfortable with sharing my own things. And by that time, I had become pretty passionate about creating my own sound and becoming sonically appealing on the same level as what I was hearing on the radio. And it became an obsession. And
what did that first record sound like?
The first thing that I actually put out, I got a lot of good feedback. No,
I'm talking about before the first thing you put out, like the first time you sit down to say, let me make something.
I didn't actually make anything until after I took lessons.
Okay.
So I went and I was taught by this guy, Thavius Beck. I think he was...
Is it Dub Spot?
Yeah, I think he was a little intertwined with Brain Feeder and all that. But he was giving these like seminars all around town with like Serato and things like that. Not Serato, with Ableton. Yeah. And I happened to pop into one, and he was so thorough with the information that I texted a friend who I knew him, and I was like, hey, do you know Thavius Beck's phone number? And he was like, yeah, sure, I'll shoot it to you. So I sent him a text message. I was like, hey, I'd really like to come sit with you. I got like maybe a couple $100. I don't think that's very much, but how many sessions can that get me? And he was like, 6. I don't remember exactly what it was. But I went to him, and he blew my mind. Like, there are people who can finesse their way through a class or a session or a set, and then there are people who are so skilled at it that it's undeniable. He's in that ladder.
100%. I've watched many YouTube videos of him.
I was like, whoa. Like, I couldn't take notes fast enough, you know? And so after that 6th class, I felt like I could make anything, you know? I was a little musically trained. Like, I had some piano lessons under my belt, so I knew when things resolved correctly and things like that. But that was, I think the first thing that I ever made was probably a remix, and it was noisy. It was a lot going on, you know. It wasn't like it was far from perfect.
Yeah, but
But I did it, and I was like, "Oh, okay. I'm feeling so bold that I'm just gonna email this to everybody, and I'm gonna submit it for all of these like awards, accolades. Like, I don't remember what it was, but there was this like beat submission website. I can't remember what it was, and I was feeling myself so hard that when I sent the email, I was like, I'm gonna be the first female in the Millionaires Boys Club.
what? It's interesting because there are so many people who, bedroom producers, hobbyists, all of that make records, and the hardest thing for them to do is to press send on an email. Where, like, were you just like, this is the greatest thing ever, or did you have a couple people who heard it who thought it was dope, or like, what made you actually go that hard with the record, knowing that, especially when you look at it back at it now, you're probably like, that shit was was like, should not have left the house.
I actually don't even think it was that bad.
Yeah.
Because Thavius had done such a good job of showing me how to make a record. Technically, my ability was strong from the jump.
Okay.
Just because he knew the program inside and out.
Yeah.
And he gave me just a little snippet of that. And a lot of the stuff I've totally forgotten now. I was probably better producer then than I am now. Because now I'm so calculated and I think everything through. But at the time, I didn't really know that much about anything other than piano. And so I tricked the record off by overproducing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, years later, it's like, I don't need to trick the record out that hard because I'm more musically inclined. It's like, how do I just make it breathe?
Where does that come from? Does it just come from making records, where you learned that there was this balance, that you could take a bunch of stuff out and still be, the record still be incredibly powerful?
I just started listening to a lot of things that I admired, and the nuances in the records that were working for me as crowd pleasers, whether or not they were classic or whether or not they were like this new age soul electronic style. You listen to things like 07 and early Estero, and you're like, there is not that much going on in these records. It breathes so much. Portishead, you listen to it and it's just like, and you have these crescendos. And when the way I started looking at it was like a painting, right? Where it was like, how big of an arch can you squeeze out of this little tiny sound before it splashes onto the other side of the painting? And the first remix that I did wasn't too far after I started. It was maybe like 6 months. Like, the guy that I was with at the time was managing this group, and they were like, yeah, you could totally do a remix for us. And I did it, and I sent it off to get mixed, and the guy was like, this is the first record you're putting out? And I was like, yeah. He's like, you need to keep going. Like, this is pretty
Awesome.
Cool. It was like sort of this Trent Reznor meets like, you know, if Trent Reznor had a lot of soul, right? Because it had these nuances of like the drilling and the like pumping and the I guess you would call it, what style would you call Nine Inch Nails? That is
industrial a little bit, I guess.
Yeah, something along those lines. And I think listening to a ton of music really helped me refine my production.
And so you've done remixes.
Yes.
Those are going well. And then obviously the logical evolution is to start to make records with vocalists? Or what was your first shift to like, oh, I'll just make these kind of like cool instrumental records? Or did you always know that you wanted vocalists on your production?
Well, I was definitely not singing myself.
Not even, you didn't think about it? You didn't get like think about the vocoder life? Like, I could maybe get away.
No, never. It was always actually really intimidating for me to sing because I have a terrible singing voice. Even when I sit at the piano for like 6 months and I do my solfege, I still don't feel like I sound that great.
Okay.
But I knew I was going to eventually have to get artists on these records. It took me a while to get to a point where I felt comfortable about calling them in. But then I quickly realized that as a producer, you can bring in a guitarist, you can bring in a bassist, you can bring people that are more musically into your sessions that help elevate them, you know. And that's what half of production is all about.
Yeah. And what was that first record? What was the first record that you did and put out that had a vocalist on it?
Take It Slow with Jack.
From
okay. Jack Davey. Yeah.
That was the first joint. What that already is, I feel like, indicative of a sound that is now not necessarily standard, but kind of in the pop zeitgeist, because it is world beat, Afrobeat, vibey a little bit. What was that? Just something that you were always drawn to? You know, because your first record is not a trap record, and it's not a crazy 128 BPM house record either. So what put you in that sort of space sonically?
The artist.
Okay.
You get in with the artist, and they have, customs that they're used to, and they want the record to start slow. It's easier for them to write on. It's easier for them to come up with melodies. And I was sort of just beholden to whatever the artist wanted for the first couple of releases. So that wasn't
a record that was created before the session?
No, okay. None of them were.
Okay.
No, that's not true. The Bosco record was created before the session. But it was... The ones that were created on the spot were just kind of like, we just got to do whatever the artist wants to do just to get the record done, you know? And then now it's kind of like, well, no, I'm not making a record for you and your project. You're getting on my record.
Those first couple sessions, I want to dig into that a little bit in a few ways. So the first thing is learning to, you go from basically doing things by yourself, right? You have all the control, you have all the time, you have all that. And now you're in a space where you have to learn how to control a room. Mm-hmm. How hard was that to get into and get over, to know that, like, A, at the end of the day, these are your records, right? Like we talked about. But then also B, being able to kind of control the pace of the session so that you actually get something done in it, rather than being stuck in. What was the learning process in that like?
Well, the biggest thing for me was always, can we get this record done today? I don't want to have to call you back in here. Yeah. Like, there's a chance you might not come back.
You always need not to trust the artist.
Yeah. So it was, I quickly realized that meeting that target was the first step.
Okay.
And
I got you.
And so I did whatever I needed to do to level up to a level where I felt comfortable with finishing a record in a day.
Okay.
You know, of course, you can always add production elements later, but in terms of like the singer getting out what they needed. Yeah.
How hard is it being a woman in a room, and especially when you have male counterparts in there, in various positions, whether it be co-production, whether it be playing, whether it be writing, and getting them to respect and understand that you control the room. Is that something that you've ever had to deal with, in other words?
Not in my sessions.
Okay.
In other people's sessions I have. Like where someone might call me in and they're like, oh, can you come into my session at Westlake with, blah, 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 whoop-de-whoop.
Yeah.
I felt more like a fish out of water in those sessions. I think that comes from two things. A, I'm not in my house. I don't have all my things.
Yeah.
Things that make me comfortable. And then B, I'm not in the driver's seat. Most of those sessions, you have an engineer, and then you have all the instruments and everything else outside of that, right? Whereas in my house, I'm the engineer, I'm the driver, and he might make it sound better than me, but taking that away automatically reduces my power. And so that was the insecurity.
Yeah.
And then you topple on top of that, men who move quite fast. And I say men because I don't think I've ever, maybe once or twice, been in a room with other female producers. It's usually always men. Female singers, yes, but usually the only other producers in the room are male. And most of the time, their mode is, how quickly can I get these ideas out? Yes, I am of the thought we should try to get this record done in a day, but I want to really make sure every idea that is placed in the session is beautifully orchestrated. Yeah. Whereas like sometimes the guys will be like, let me just get this out.
We can change
it later, and I didn't always work on that frequency. Yeah. That was the intimidating thing, was like, oh, I got to get in where I fit in. I don't even know how quickly I'm going to be able to do these things.
Has it gotten better?
A little bit, yes and no. I've realized that I always go to sessions now with things prepared, whether or not it's chords, or maybe I've sampled something. I don't usually ever sample other people's records. I sample like my own records, right? So if I had a session with, Giveon, I would use those vocals and use them and trick them out and put them in simpler and like transpose them down and
make them into something that
you would never recognize. Yeah.
So it's interesting you talk about obviously being the only female producer in the room. And you're the only female producer that I've ever actually worked with. So, although I will say that a lot of female singers don't give themselves credit for the amount of production that they do.
That they contribute?
Yeah, because there's a lot of women I've been in the room with where it is, oh, maybe these chords should resolve like this, maybe this piece should go here, the vocals should sound like this, there should be some more sounds or something in the hook, take this out to let this breathe. There's a lot of production that I think they don't often give themselves credit for. So in terms of non-singing female producers, you're the only producer that I worked with. But was that ever, from the beginning, was that ever an intimidating sort of thing? Because I always am curious as to why there aren't more. And it didn't seem like, as you were talking about it, it didn't ever seem like it was something that people told you shouldn't be doing. So what was it, were you just like, oh yeah, I'm going to produce now? And there was, like, did anyone ever say like, no, women don't produce, should be?
I heard this silly quote once where it was like, black female artists don't play guitars. And it was sort of a metaphor for all of the entertainment industry, for me. And this was coming from a person who was pretty high up. I don't know if he was like the head of a record label or if he was the A&R at a record label, but the name I recognized.
Yeah.
And I do think that people are reserved to thinking certain professions are gender divided. Yeah. And I mean, the balance is still overwhelmingly leaning towards men.
Yeah.
And it's 2019, and like all of my sessions still this year were with men. So it's not like it's changed. I think that the learning curve is so high and it's so tedious that it discourages a lot of women who are not as technically savvy to dive in further.
So you think having had DJ'd for a while, by that point, you'd become comfortable enough in the technical space?
Yes.
That it wasn't such a crazy
No.
leap, because you're like, oh, I understand. Yeah, there's a... I try to, any of the female DJs that I mentor, I try to make sure that above all else, even outside of simply being able to blend, being able to, choose the right records, that they know the ins and outs, that if the equipment breaks in the middle, they know how to fix it.
Right.
Because I think there is this weird, there's a guy to do that thing that sometimes sits there where it's like, oh, if I, this chord or this thing, the equipment isn't working. Mm-hmm. Somebody will be here to fix it. Whereas like, yeah, that's not always the case. And every DJ, period, should know how to do it. But especially, I think, women DJs often, especially when they're starting, because the acceleration happens, I think, really quickly.
Yeah.
I know people that are making more money than me that have been DJing less than 6 months.
Right.
Because of technology now. And
how does that make you feel?
I understand the nature of what it is.
Yeah.
I can't romanticize the profession, because I know that there's somebody that probably feels that way about me. I'm not a virtuoso piano player.
Yeah.
But I've probably had bigger produced records than somebody who could outplay me, in a second.
Yeah.
Who am I to just, I would be that weird person sitting back there just like, they can't even play Bach in whatever, inverted, blah, 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 blah. But I was able to, because of technology and know-how and curiosity and whatever else, be able to learn how to produce to have, certain kind of records. So I don't really, the biggest thing that I do is try to contribute. What I don't want is, if I know you and you're one of those women, I don't want you to be whack when you show up to DJ.
Oh yeah.
Like
I had to learn that quick, because I was getting tossed into gigs that were far beyond my level of comprehension before I was ready. And that was like, oh, you've only been DJing for 6 months? Well, you're going to open up for Erykah Badu next week. And it's like, oh, okay. And you've got all these people in the room who know a lot about hip hop. And it's like, how hard can you flex your hip hop knowledge right now? And knowing when to flex was really the icing on the cake for me, right? It was like, don't be dainty. Crush it.
Yeah.
Like, you've practiced this. You know these records. Like, it's not a stretch for you to play Lil' Kim, Notorious B.I.G., and 3 6 Mafia, or whatever you want to throw in there. It's like, no, this is what you've been listening to your whole entire life.
Exactly.
Just put these records together, people will love you. But put them together in a very interesting way, and don't be lazy. Don't let the record play for 3 minutes.
Yeah, that's another thing that I've been trying to get people to get better at, is learning, like, we're in the last chorus. Why have you allowed this to happen?
Nobody wants to hear this record until the straight. Yeah.
Word of advice to all young DJs.
Yes.
If you are not out by the end of the second chorus, you have a problem. Yeah. Nothing should ever play into the third verse. No. Things sometimes barely even make it past the first chorus, but definitely not past the second chorus. So that's just something to always remember. How did you prepare for that in that short amount of time? Did you just dig in at home and just be like, I'm going to do these mixes over and over again until I get it right? Or like, what did you do to prepare for Erica? And
I just made sure that I was respecting the culture. And, you know, I opened up for Maceo once, and that gig taught me a valuable lesson, because he had heard one of my mixes in someone's car, and he was like, who is this? And it was all funk and soul. I had this mix series that I did called OSS, OSS Radio. I don't remember what it stood for. Oh shit son. Oh shit son. Okay. was what it stood for. And it was all like rare groove, you know, SOS band, like records people have been sampling for years. And he heard it and was like, I want her to open up for my show. But instead of sticking to the script, as I should have done, I think I threw in like a Bruno Mars curveball. And I will never forget how like disgusted he was with that selection. And he was so cool and he was so sweet and so respectful of me still. But I did feel that energy shift. And it was such a valuable lesson, because I was like, I will never make that mistake again. Like, there are certain crates that are sacred and cannot be infiltrated by pop. You know, like you can't put any pop music in those crates. And that was one of those crates. I literally have a folder in my computer called Wax. And it's like, these are records that smack from like the 60s, 70s. And like, if I'm playing that set,
no Bruno.
No, nothing else goes in that set.
That's so funny. So obviously you learned to DJ within constraints.
Yeah. Setting is a skill within itself. And I hear so many DJs these days that don't know how to set. They may know how to mix, but they don't know how to set. Yeah. And what I mean by that is that every 15 minutes is a set. Yeah. Like, you cannot avoid setting in 15 minutes. Yeah. Like, there has to be something that happens in the arc of that set in 15 minutes that happens in every 15 minutes of the duration of your whole set, right? You have to peak and you have to valley. Yeah. And I learned very quickly that if I didn't know how to focus within those 15 minutes, I was going to sound like I was all over the place. It's like, open format is cool and you can do it, but you still have to set within that 15-minute structure.
Yeah. I often tell people that the reason why I don't take requests is because a request, valid or not, good or not, is 7 or 8 songs. You're not actually asking for one song.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm in the middle of an old school hip hop set and you want an 80s record, in order for me to get from that to that, is going to take a whole conversation.
Yeah.
And I'll get to it, but you're shifting what the entire, vibe is, which is why it's so, I think some people often need to understand, like, when you're asking for your song that you want to hear, you're asking for a whole lot more than you think. Unless there's the random person who just knows enough to be like, this would be the next perfect song, and they just hit it out the park. But it doesn't often happen. Most of the time people are just like, I want to hear Old Town Road, and you're like, I'm playing Motown right now. Like, this is not happening. To get back to the production stuff a little bit. So you put your first record out. have gotten a lot of traction in the music licensing world.
Yes.
Where do those dots begin to connect? Because do you put your first record out with a label or just by yourself?
I haven't put out any records with a label yet.
Okay, so you just put that Take It Slow out by yourself.
Yeah.
What was your process in putting it out? You know, I want to break down a little bit. I think get in the weeds here, because I think a lot of people, again, there's always a bunch of people who are kind of just like, oh, I want to, I make records, but they don't know what to do next other than post something on SoundCloud.
Yeah.
So like, what were the steps for you in terms of putting out the record and promoting the record, and then getting, because that record was licensed, right?
Recently.
Oh, okay.
I didn't have the formula down.
Okay.
There was something sonically in my records that was appealing to music supervisors, and I was thankful enough to know.
How did it even get to them?
The first record that I ever put a lot of money into was the Bosco record.
Okay.
And with Bosco came more resources. So she actually pitched the record herself, even though it was my record, to Insecure on HBO. And that was the first placement that I ever ended up getting. And it was a big placement because it went on to go onto the soundtrack of that season, which was season 2. And it was like Bryson Tiller. I mean, I don't know if Bryson Tiller was on there, but SZA was definitely on there. It was heavy hitters. And then at the bottom you see my name and you're like, what the, how did I end up here, you know? And that was my introduction into music sync and licensing. And I think once you have one, especially a big one, I think other music supervisors take note, you know? And there's nuances in my music that hit the traditional licensable music, you know?
Yeah. But in terms of, you mentioned putting money into the records. What was different between that record and what you did with the Take It Slow? Because what did you learn in that time in terms of how to release a record?
I didn't put any money into Take It Slow.
Okay.
I don't think I put any money at all. Maybe $100 or something for artwork, and like we just put it out.
So you just put it out, posted it up,
yeah,
and then sent it to a bunch of people.
Yeah, sent it to I just from DJing and dancing and going out all the time. I know people, you know. Some of them work at labels, some of them are A&Rs, some are doing amazing and penetrating culture in a really cool way. And I was getting good feedback. And so that was giving me energy to just kind of keep propelling forward. People were showing up to my events, and sometimes they were other dope artists, and I'd be like, oh, you should get on a record, you know? I have probably 20 records that I've done with various different artists. Only 4 of them have seen the light of day, but I think the formula that works is hard to crack, but I think once you crack it, you're like, okay, does this song have curse words in it? That's A. That's a big one. Yeah. None of my songs have curse words in them. Is it melodically sitting in a place where if I played any other record, radio or not, could you tell that it maybe brought the energy down, or did it consistently stay in that pocket?
Yeah.
Around the genre, around the same genre.
Yeah.
And, you know, I would listen to records that other people had out, and it was like, how close can I get my record to this? Like, what's the ABAB structure? Am I hitting all those things? Mm-hmm. You know, is there a bridge? Is there an intro? Is there an outro? And the formula for streaming is actually different than the formula that works for placements. Yeah. They're similar, but things that get highly placed are just in a different category.
So up until, let's say recently, all of your releases had been with women. Mm-hmm. Was that on purpose?
At the time, yes. I was trying to put out a record that was all female driven.
Okay. What was the reasoning behind it?
It was just the era we were in. I had always had a really strong female support group. 90% of them just so happened to be artists. And I was having trouble getting in the room with men and feeling comfortable. So I just worked with women at the time.
And then how does that change when you start working with Tabby? Because you guys did a whole record together.
Tabby's been a friend of mine for so long. So he had an N, and I had done a mixtape of his years ago that did pretty well for him. So he was like, I want to enlist you to do my next project. And I was like, okay. And it took us like a year to finish that project. And, you know, I brought in all sorts of musicians and other people and other producers to try to really help me bring it home. And I think it ended up coming out great.
Yeah.
That was the first project that I ever did as an executive producer.
Was there anything different that you learned in terms of dealing with a male artist in that sort of space?
You know, I followed all the formulas that I did with the previous records, and I didn't place any of those songs. Musically, I don't know what happened. When I was going through submissions with my sync guy, nobody bit. And I don't know, I can't say that it's just because it's a male on the records. Yeah. But it did make me think, is it easier to place a record with a female on it? I don't think that is the case, but it did make me think it.
Yeah.
Because I will say my batting average for syncs is very high.
Yeah.
I have 3 placements and only 4 records out.
From my placements, what I would say is that I've discussed this with a few of my male friends that do a ton of placements, Out of Sight a couple weeks ago. There's a certain kind of party vibe that is wanted from a male artist. Like, when you look
I could see that.
The records are a lot more high energy, a lot of big event crescendo sort of stuff. And I would say that none of those records, none of those records on the album are that. Are you able to talk about the situation that you have now, or is that official yet, or no?
No, it's not official.
Okay, fine.
But I will say that I'm excited about my next chapter. I've been working on these records for a year now, and the original EP that I was going to put out didn't come out. And that was an emotional attachment that I had to situations that didn't go the way that I wanted to. Yeah. And I had to just walk away from those records because it was painful to listen to them. It was bringing up memories that I didn't want to recollect. And so I was like, you know what, fuck it, I'm just going to start a whole new batch of records. And I think there's males on almost all the records.
Oh, really? So it's totally
flopped, yeah.
Interesting. I want to shift gears a whole lot, but this will be like the last little question. You and I have talked about it before, but there's the weird balance that artists, and especially female artists, have to have in that social media now is so demanding of you and content. Mm-hmm. And there, being a woman, there's a cheat code to it to an extent.
I've been trying to use it less, honestly.
But how do you strike that balance? You've been trying to use social media less in general, or cheat codes less?
Cheat codes.
Okay.
In the midst of, going out and trying to find a deal and trying to find partners to put out my next project, I realized that I didn't want to be overly sexualized. I thought that would be deterring and weaken my brand. Mm-hmm. and the shift is still sort of taking place, but I see my peers who are talking much louder and, you know, are far more narcissistic than I could ever be. And I'm like, I don't want that smoke. I don't even want to compete with those girls. Like, if I have to put on a bikini and I have to wear, you know, like skimpily clad clothes and like almost have every part of me exposed every time I post just to sell a song, I don't want a part of that.
Yeah.
The song needs to speak for itself. Whatever sort of marketing plan I can stir up underneath that to get it going will be smarter and wiser and hit a more intellectual audience than the dumbed down shit. Yeah. But there's still a way to access those, you know, consumers.
So you've been pulling back, but trying to be more strategic in what you post, how you post.
Yes.
Have you noticed a shift in engagement because of it?
My engagement has been going up.
Okay.
I think that's just because of my brand and who I am, and I have a lot of connections, and I'm always connecting with people. But I also think it's because I'm being truthful. I'm being transparent. Like, this is just who I am. Like, I'm wearing a t-shirt and a bonnet today. Like, deal with it, you know? And I feel like people are more receptive to that energy than like, I'm also really hot. And look how bad I look in this fucking tight dress, you know? Like, I made this post yesterday and I deleted it quickly because I was like, I don't want that kind of attention anymore.
Okay.
Like, you immediately have lowest common denominators in your comment section talking about, you know, twinkles in my eyes, and I don't want that. That's the kind of attention you can save and keep for yourself, because I'd much rather you tell me like, oh, you're talented than, oh, you're hot.
No, I feel that. Well, I look forward to the next chapter. So thank you for being a part. Yay! Thank you for coming on the podcast.
You're welcome.
That's it. It's a wrap. Free range. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Smiles Davis. And if you like what we're doing on the Free Range podcast, make sure that you subscribe everywhere that you get your podcasts. And make sure you go back, if this is your first time checking in, and listening to 1 through 14. We've had some really interesting conversations, and I would love for you to dive in and find out